Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dean Powell. I'm the Senior SciTech Analyst from the Good Food Institute Asia Pacific, and I'll be talking about precision fermentation regulatory landscape in APAC. Apologies I couldn't join the live presentation. I hope the recording's useful for you. My background, I've been working on novel food regulatory systems in the region, mainly looking at cultivated meat, but also looking at the fermentation landscape as well. And hopefully you can find some of this information useful. So let's move ahead. So Asia Pacific's obviously a big region. I won't be able to cover every country in the same level of detail. So first I'll talk through our understanding of the environment in China and recent developments there. And then I'll move on to what we've termed production hubs in the APAC region. And finally, what we look at just as consumer markets in the APAC region. And again, we don't talk about all, but we'll just look at those we think would be of most interest or have the greatest opportunity. So first, looking at China, the regulatory agencies we have to consider there are primarily the National Health Commission, which is the ultimate approver of novel food products. And within NHC, we have the National Food Safety Risk Assessment Center, CFSA, and they do the actual technical reviews of applications. And the CFSA sits underneath the NHC. And so there has been evolving regulatory landscape in China over decades, but most recently in September 2024, the CFSA put out its notice on improving the requirements for safety evaluation data of 3 new foods, which does cover precision fermentation products. And so this outlined trial requirements for application materials for the safety evaluation of genetically modified microorganisms used in food processing. And so specifically, the notice is significant because it has now provided a pathway for ingredients and additives derived from precision fermentation using genetically modified microorganisms to be approved. And it outlines their safety assessment requirements, as well as outlining that this will be done on a case-by-case basis, even for identical final products. And so let me just move myself here so you can see this last point. But basically, what we have at the moment in terms of approved products is human milk oligosaccharides, which were first approved in 2024. And we have multiple E. coli strains were approved with transgenes from different bacterial species to produce these HMOs. So they're the first kind of food ingredient relevant cases we've seen approved in China. And when we look at the NHC's review timeline, there'll be many similarities to other countries, but just a few specifics here. So the NHC accepts an application. It then has up to 60 days to assemble an expert review panel for that application. From there, the main 3 variables we have are specific Q&As from this expert panel, and these can potentially go over several rounds of feedback. We may see requests for information from the NHC, depending on the completeness and quality of documentation. So as is the case anywhere, having more work up front done in your application will save time in assessment. The final main variable is the product category that the product would fit within, or if it fits in several product categories, we may see unique applications where we have varying numbers of assessment subjects. We might have case-specific technical considerations. So as an example, if the product category your product is aiming for has applications in baby and toddler food, that will be a relatively longer timeline. And so overall, based on what we've seen in the notice, this should be a 1 to 2 year process, with those baby and toddler food examples being at the 2-year end, and other simpler food ingredients maybe leaning towards the 1-year end. But this is a relatively new area, so I'm sure these timelines will be subject to some variation while initial cases are assessed. So moving on from China to what we've termed our potential production hubs. So these are countries with access to some of the following characteristics that we think are crucial to potentially house large-scale manufacturing of precision fermentation products going forward. These key considerations are they have low-cost feedstocks, favorable cost and business environment, ideally clear and efficient regulatory pathways, which we'll get into, or compelling government incentives. And so this list of 3 countries is actually part of a soon-to-be-released report that we have commissioned in the GFA APAC team, where we assessed different countries' potential to be scale-up hubs. And these are kind of our three main contenders from that analysis that's going to be released in the next month or so. So first we have Australia. So they have a very clear regulatory framework where we have the Food Standards Code, and specifically Standard 1.5.2 of GM foods, and enzymes from GM organisms under Standard 1.3.3. And so it's important to note that they're not actually using the standard for novel foods, and FSAN specifically decided to use the standard for GM foods as part of its assessment of impossible foods like hemoglobin, and stated that going forward it will assess all similar PF-derived ingredient applications under the GM foods standard. But that is to say that both the novel food standard and the GM food standards have very similar requirements. So this is more a documentation and referencing point of note rather than materially impacting the type of safety data you'll necessarily need. And so because we're looking at these as potential production hubs, we'll discuss the import of genetically modified microbes in addition to the products to be sold themselves. So genetically modified microbes, or GMMs, they're assessed by the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, the OGTR. And Food Standards Australia and New Zealand is responsible for approving and labeling of novel foods and GMOs. FSANZ is the shared regulator for Australia and New Zealand. So we're only looking at Australia right here, but they do cover both countries. So when we're looking at the OGTR, they have a license application, which typically takes 6 to 9 months. It includes public consultation for importing GMMs. And then they do an audit of permitted strains every 6 to 9 months. Iterations on strains, so making minor changes to your strain, technically requires the same process to be begun again. But we have been told in practice that the industry pragmatically self-regulates on this front, and minor modifications are not typically resubmitted for assessment by the OGTR, and that's kind of the status quo. And so foods producing GMOs require pre-market approval unless the final product contains no detectable foreign DNA or protein. And as I said, FSANZ has assessed soy like hemoglobin by Impossible Foods and approved that. And you can see an extensive public safety assessment document published by FSANZ on that, where you can get a lot of insight into their assessment methodology. An application typically takes 18 to 24 months and costs around 150 to 200,000 Australian dollars, which is about 100 to 130 USD. And so products familiar to the agency may be approved in under 12 months, whereas more novel products, again, such as the hemoglobin, did hit around that 2-year mark. And approved products do have strict GMO labeling requirements locally unless they contain known GM materials. Our next country of interest is Thailand, which we see as a potentially very competitive scale-up hub, with their main weakness actually being their regulatory environment. So the Thai Food and Drug Administration regulates food products, including the import of microbes, regardless of whether they are the food item or actually produce the ingredient itself. These are assessed under the Ministry of Public Health and Notification 431 from 2022, as well as foods derived from genetically modified organisms, and the Ministerial Notification 432, which concerns the labeling of GM foods. So it's important to note that approval is required to import and produce strains and product, so not just the sale of the product. And what we mean there is if you wanted to choose Thailand as your scale-up production hub because it's a low-cost operating environment with good business incentives, even if you plan to export 100% of your precision fermentation derived product, you'll still have to go through Thai FDA and get it approved for local sale, because they do not allow production of PF ingredients unless it has been approved for local sale. So that's different to many other locations. So it's an important one to note there. And that being said, the import of GMMs, they have a categorization systems. So some microorganisms are publicly classed as safe, which are called good industrial large-scale practice. Others are classified as group 1 pathogens, generally regarded as safe, and generally they're not actually pathogenic, that's just what they're called. But these only require notification to the Thai FDA. And the next tier down is new microbes, which might require a longer actual safety assessment. And so seeking approval for novel foods consists of 2 stages. So the first is the novel food safety assessment, which has a timeline generally 7 to 12 months. So biotech, which is the kind of technical assessment agency under the National Science and Technology Development Agency, they do the assessment on Thai FDA's behalf. So they take the novel food data package and have 7 to 12 months for the assessment if there's a genetically modified microbe involved. If there's no GMM involved, that can be reduced and be between 3 to 7 months. 3 to 12 months. So once that assessment is being completed, registration of the product is then considered by the Thai FDA. And so a letter from biotech based on their safety assessment is submitted to Thai FDA, as well as some other documents from the company. And then Thai FDA has around 1 to 2 months review before they may approve and register a product. But we've been told in practice that it actually can take more like 3 to 5 years for this whole process to be undertaken. So that's kind of the difference between what you'd get from a statutory perspective versus what industry is seeing in reality. And our final country for consideration, sorry, my head is covering that, but it says Vietnam there. So Vietnam is more of an outlier case when looking at potential production hubs. It's got a lot of future potential and is positioning itself from a international competitiveness perspective to be a production hub by investing in larger sugar production and more efficient sugar production while having aggressive government incentives and favorable business environment. So for Vietnam, we can see that there's the General Food Safety Law that covers products, as well as the specific Decree 69 from 2010, which has been amended several times, that deals with genetically modified organisms specifically. And so the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, which is MARD, as you'll see in the table there, they are the main assessment organization for the GMO itself. And to use them, you are required to get a GMO as food certificate from MARD. Separate to them, we have the Vietnam Food Administration, which is the primary authority overseeing food safety regulation and compliance in Vietnam. So what we see is that food products not approved as edible GMOs must obtain their certification of the GMO's eligibility for use as food before undergoing the approval procedure for food products. So going to MARD first before then going to the VFA. And a GMO can be certified for use as food if it satisfies one of the following conditions. If it's been approved in at least 5 developed countries, has been evaluated and deemed low risk by Vietnam's Genetically Modified Food Safety Council, and microorganisms do not have their own regulatory guidelines and are treated as food products themselves. And this approval of microorganisms as food products can take at least a year. But this can be shortened if the product already has approvals from regulatory agencies of a variety of other countries with their own rigorous regulatory frameworks, such as your EUs or US or other major markets. And so there is meant to be a list from MARD of GMOs as food certificate grantees, but that is not actually the case as far as we can tell. In terms of timelines, it's at least 1 year, but unclear in practice, and the opacity of the system in Vietnam is one of its large drawbacks. But despite the lack of a clear framework, investment and permitting decisions for large-scale projects can get fast-tracked approvals, and Vietnam has implemented processes to facilitate the approval of GMOs that may be used for productions of chemicals and proteins via precision fermentation. So we do have cases that can be referenced to show that companies can get through this process and launch large-scale production. but these have so far been outside the food environment. So let me just move myself around again. So next we'll look at consumer markets in APAC. So from our analysis, we don't consider these as potential production hubs, but they can be important consumer markets going forward. And we have used, I have used a color key on these slides, a stoplight system, green, orange, red. So the first market, Singapore, very famous internationally for its approach to novel foods. It has a fairly recent regulatory framework of the novel foods category under their food regulations. They have a number of products that have been approved in the precision fermentation world as food ingredients. Perfect Day and Remilk for beta-lactoglobulin, Impossible Foods like hemoglobin, and the two key bodies are the Singapore Food Agency and their genetic modification advisory committee that reports to SFA. SFA estimates its timeline is around 9 to 12 months, but this varies in practice and is not a timeline set as a statutory requirement. So it can be up to the vagaries of if a company is producing locally or the manpower that's available to SFA at any given time. And given they have had a lot of international interest, they have to be, prioritized very strictly as they have a lot of companies trying to get approval. If we move on from Singapore to Japan, which has a lot less green on it, unfortunately, their framework is the standards and procedures for assessing the safety of genetically modified microorganisms. In terms of products approved, we haven't seen any modern precision fermentation dry food ingredients approved. We just have more classic microbial enzymes and chymosin as food processing aids. These assessments are done under the Food Safety Commission, and we've been told by people in Japan that this process can take up to 10 years. It's a very conservative regulator. GM foods are a sensitive topic there, so this is quite a large barrier to assessment locally. And the framework is in yellow as we don't have any provisions within that framework that specifically address precision fermentation food ingredients as opposed to Singapore, which does. South Korea is in a somewhat similar position to Japan. They have the standards for recognition of temporary standards and specifications for food, which similarly does not have specific subsections addressing precision fermentation ingredients or food products assessment requirements. And again, they also have the classic microbial enzymes and chymosin as food processing aids available in the local market. These are assessed by the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. And we lack some on-the-ground knowledge on what practical timelines are actually being experienced by companies in this space. I will note in terms of the regulatory framework and timelines that although novel food products can be approved under these general temporary standards, when it came to cultivated meat, MFDS decided to amend them to create a subcategory that specifically has the assessment criteria for cultivated meat before they accepted and have begun assessing an application. And we think that before they assess precision fermentation food ingredients, we may see a similar amendment made so that there's more specific assessment criteria outlined in their regulatory framework. If we go to New Zealand, much more green. As I mentioned, they share FSANs with Australia. So we have the same regulatory framework there, products approved. The difference here is that regulation of the genetically modified microorganisms themselves is quite different, where New Zealand has had a very strict approach to GMMs and gene editing, which has basically banned genetically modified microorganism-based commercial production in New Zealand until a major revision to their regulations in 2024. As part of that, they proposed to establish a gene technology regulator, but that is not yet established. So there has been significant changes and improvements that could allow local production in addition to the sale of these products, but that's still unfolding. Again, they have the same 18 to 24 month statutory timeline for product approvals under FSANZ. And the last category here is other Southeast Asian countries. So these are countries that are low priority and we haven't had the time to do in-depth assessments of. But in general, they lack specific novel foods or subcategories of novel foods to address genetically modified organism-based food production. So we haven't seen any modern precision fermentation derived ingredients approved outside of your classic enzymes, chymosin, etc. again. And the timelines here are often not defined by a statutory limit, or where a limit exists, it's not necessarily what you'll get in practice, similar to what we've seen in Thailand, for example. If anyone does have questions on specific countries, we would be happy to talk with you about those. And we do have networks we can look into if there are particular countries that are of interest to stakeholders for us to explore further. And with that, I'll just say thank you for your time. If you have any questions or follow-up, please feel free to reach out to me at dmp@gfi.org. And thank you for your time. Cheers.